During the process of this research project, one of our key focuses has been on which groups within the LGBTQ+ community have been represented the most in LGBTQ+ archives, who is being represented the most to the British public searching for information. As our quantitative findings show, the majority of entries we found focused on the terms lesbian and gay, which is unsurprising as these are some of the most long-standing and well-used and understood terms. However, as our research has shown, the terms bisexual and transgender aren't too far behind in the chronology of queer linguistics. Stonewall UK begins its timeline in 1951 with a reference to a transgender woman, for example. But all of our researchers have felt that there is an overwhelming majority of explicit information about gay and lesbian individuals and groups, and not so much about bisexual and transgender groups, let alone other sexualities and gender identities. Therefore, in this video, I'm going to take a closer look at some of the bisexual and transgender representations in the archives that we've compiled and explore some of our experiences with how these groups have been documented. A large number of resources we have found use the acronym LGBT, but only focus on the first two initials. While it is tempting to use the excuse that gay and lesbian are more popular and understood terms, the fact that they mention the full acronym shows that there is an awareness of these terms in these historical archives, but there isn't so much detail about bisexual and transgender history. For example, the LSE Library's description of their collection on Gallup has frequent references to the LGBT community as a term, but focuses predominantly on lesbian and gay history, detailing parts of the complex relationship between police and lesbian and gay people. While it includes the terms bisexual and transgender, there is much less of a focus on the relationships between these groups and the police, and mentions of their history in general. Another instance where bisexual and transgender representation in LGBT archives has been diluted is often in the language that's used surrounding entries about transgender and bisexual people. Our project has tracked many terms across our resources in an effort not to misappropriate modern terms to historical figures, but often the same attitude has been taken with contemporary instances of queer history, as terminology around queer identities, aside from lesbian and gay, has been generally unclear. We expect the lack of clarity in older resources where terms for transgender and non-binary people just simply didn't exist within the popular lexicon, but with contemporary resources it's quite startling to find that the explicit terms transgender and trans man, trans woman aren't always used in order to signpost that this is transgender or bisexual history. This has made us consider what it is to be represented in a historical archive, for if the reader can't understand what is being represented, is it really representation? Are they able to understand what is being communicated and who is being communicated? This can be seen in the Stonewall UK timeline, as it details the Corbett versus Corbett divorce case in 1970. It is written in the timeline that the court case established a precedent that a person's sex cannot legally be changed from that which is assigned at birth. This was the divorce of April Ashley and her husband Arthur Corbett, after she was publicly outed as a transgender woman, a term which she used and was used around her. The language of this entry is somewhat confusing and omits any mentions of Ashley's identity. This case is essentially decontextualised, and while this timeline is for key dates and requires brevity and does mention language surrounding trans issues, it misses out on the opportunity to explicitly mention a trans woman, an early case as well within the length of the timeline, and therefore conveys a slightly twisted narrative about the place of trans women in the chronology of queer history. Another observation we have made in this process is that the trans and bi representations available are often the same repeated handful of dates and figures. And while this is consistent with historical archives, the fact that it is only the select few trans individuals in comparison to the wide range of lesbian and gay figures is quite startling. For example, Roberta Carroll is our second most referenced person across all of our archives. She was a trans woman from 1951. She seems to have acted as a placeholder for the list of trans figures within our collation is still shorter than that of lesbian and gay figures, despite other trans figures existing. For example, the Stonewall UK archive, once again, discusses the Stonewall riots in the 1960s, but doesn't discuss the presence of the many trans women who were part of that, particularly Marsha P. Johnson, a well-known LGBT figure. This is contrasted by this particular archive's references on 3 separate occasions to Sir Ian McKellen. And while Sir Ian McKellen is a big part of LGBT history in Britain, and also of the creation of Stonewall UK, there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy in the emphasis put on certain sexualities and certain people. Finally, we have also observed that, like ethnic minority groups, queer minorities have developed their own archives separate from main popular ones. These are often smaller, less financed, and more undeveloped. For example, the Proud Trust has a list of notable trans figures, but they are not predominantly an archive. Similarly, many entries into mainstream archives around transgender and bisexual history are notices of the founding of separate community resources, such as the creation of BICON in 1984, or the Mermaids Charity for Transgender Children and Their Families in 1995. LGBT history archives are therefore presented with this split between the L and the G and the B and the T, not to mention many other sexualities and gender identities which are generally not included. This is also probably because terms have developed from the past to the contemporary period, but there are less instances of any kind of grey areas being included in a lot of key archives. The need to kind of focus on key dates and legislation and things that are tangible and easy to express to readers has probably shaped some of this, as more difficult concepts are often omitted from the more popular archives. This leaves parts of the LGBTQ+ community partially erased in archives, and in a sense the archives are not fully expressive or reflective of the community itself or what the community is trying to be. It reflects a more fractious and divisive set of separate communities with separate histories when they are actually kind of all part of one another, which I think LGBTQ+ history archives should endeavour to emulate and reflect in their recordings and presentations of history.